Lucia Vega worked in a room that loved to pretend it didn't need her. She moved along the bank of glass and cold mahogany with a soft cloth in one hand and the jade pen in the other, polishing the boardroom table until it caught the light like a promise someone else could afford. Sandalwood from a sachet inside her jacket clung to her sleeves. A faint line back to a kitchen where a hospital monitor blinked and an eviction notice waited on the countertop. Outside, the city had not yet learned it would be the kind of winter that made choices feel like knives. The executive meeting had dissolved hours earlier. Voices, precise, indulgent, had bled through the outer room's frosted glass. Laughs clipped like shears. The casual cruelty of men who learned consequences came later for other people. Lucia balanced the jade pen by its clip now, turning it between her fingers. Her father had given it to her the day she learned to render two languages into one idea without losing the other's breath. He had said, "Keep this when you lend your voice." She had kept it like a pledge. If you like human-centered corporate dramas and stories about people who turn invisibility into leverage, stay with this one till the end, and if it speaks to you, consider subscribing. It helps us tell more of the quiet fights that matter. The outer door clicked. Someone had left a leather portfolio at the head of the table. Lucia's palms went dry. There was a single sheet inside, folded in the corner. Chinese characters, tight and formal, stamped with a date. Her mouth made the shape of a word in Mandarin before she read it. Hedong, contract. Her heart did the same with a dollar sign, $27,400, printed beneath a clause in English. The figure small on the page, but immense in her life. Tucked along the margin, in corporate shorthand, a due date, 72 hours. The company wanted a clean translation before the video conference with Hangtech. The translation would steer negotiations. Whoever provided it would be seen as indispensable. Her eviction notice said 72 hours too. She sat on the floor by the cabinet, the ache in her knees the only complaint she let herself have. In the building's reflected lights, the ink on the page felt like a blade to hold between two bodies. Not just hers and her mother's, but a third that had grown in the world where her work did not exist on payroll lines. She had been the woman who cleaned the boardroom after the men had finished proving their plans. She had been the woman who fixed the printer, who listened to knock-off jokes and small commands, who translated a title or a sentence when someone on another floor asked for it in passing. Invisible competence had been her currency. Now the company wanted to spend it. Her eviction notice said 72 hours too. She sat on the floor by the cabinet, the ache in her knees the only complaint she let herself have. In the building's reflected lights, the ink on the page felt like a blade to hold between two bodies. Not just hers and her mother's, but a third that had grown in the world where her work did not exist on payroll lines. She had been the woman who cleaned the boardroom after the men had finished proving their plans. She had been the woman who fixed the printer, who listened to knock-off jokes and small commands, who translated a title or a sentence when someone on another floor asked for it in passing. Invisible competence had been her currency. Now the company wanted to spend it. She memorized the characters first, running her mind along the strokes like a fingertip along a seam. "You're late," Marco said when he found her at the front desk, the portfolio tucked beneath her coat. "Not late," she said, "needed to finish." "Don't stay too long with the suit's ghosts," he muttered, an old joke. He did not know the detail of her business. He only knew she polished more diligently than most cleaners, and sometimes brought back fortune cookie notes of corporate wisdom she would toss in the trash. When she left the building, the air bit at her cheeks. She walked fast, the jade pen heavy in her pocket. At home, Min's face was thinner than yesterday. The eviction notice lay on the counter like a flat promise. Lucia slid the translation into an envelope and placed it under a stack of unpaid bills. She told herself she would send it anonymously to the corporate inbox that handled external translators. Submit, wash her hands, collect a small, private reward later. She would not be seen. She would be a ghost-proof pen. Her phone vibrated the moment she closed the door. A text from an unknown number. "We have a conference with Hangtech. Need final translation before 10. Competitive fee, $27,400. Deadline, 72 hours. Respond if able." Short, precise. Someone on the inside was fishing for convenience and expertise. The same teeth, dressed in a new habit. Lucia sat on the floor with the jade pen in her lap and the hotel of fluorescent light in the hallway humming like an uneasy audience. The line between an offer and a threat thinned when you had someone else's life on the table. 72 hours. 72 hours and an eviction truck that would come any minute if she could not find the money. She made a choice that night that would send ripples into rooms she had only ever cleaned. She replied, not with her name, but with the translation attached. She uploaded it to the anonymous translator inbox from a public computer at the library that evening. The city's warmth, a buffer against the cold certainty that someone else could use what she had offered for good or for glass. The first time the company used her translation, it felt like a gentle theft, one that would not hurt her. They posted it as a cleaner, faster translation from a contracting specialist. An email chain recognized the text and praised its clarity. Comments in a Slack channel, crisp, dismissive, called it efficient. Nobody credited a cleaning woman's hand. That anonymity was the protection she had sought, a way to earn without exposing men to the city's merciless glare. But the boardroom's intrigue did not stay small. There are men whose mouths are trained to turn compliments into territory. Derek Willis to everyone who liked the sound of owning things, noticed the clarity of the translation. He liked things he could claim, and he liked people who could make his claims seem smarter. Willis took the translation, polished it in his voice, and began to use it as a tool in his own ascent. When a line in Lucia's rendering made a clause look less dangerous, Willis highlighted it in the meeting and suggested it be used as the official reading. She watched at a distance. She saw how men like Willis could take the work of someone anonymous and turn it into an asset, a lever for their own raise. When the company posted the finalized translation, they credited an in-house lead. Willis had skimmed the anonymous submission, accepted the reading, and affixed his name in the places that mattered. The translation did its job in the negotiation. Hangtech softened a proposed clause. On paper, the company had saved $27,400. In practice, the maneuver opened a way for Willis's favored outsourcing partner to take over a section of operations. Layoffs buzzed under coffee filters. People who had names and families were slotted into cost-saving measures. Lucia saw the ripple, and it felt like a hand on her throat. At home, the eviction notice's deadline moved nearer. Men's breaths became a rhythm Lucia could count on her fingertips. Lucia's bank account offered a polite lie instead of relief. There were ways to use the anonymous credit to ease immediate burdens, if no one discovered its origin. Then came the theft. Willis, in a small, careful moment, stole the jade pen. They had been in a late meeting. Lucia had lingered in the shadows, polishing the chairs, while Willis collected applause for steering the negotiation. The pen had been on the table, a talisman he mistook for ornament. That same night, it was gone from Lucia's bag the moment she glanced away. The jade's heft was replaced by a vacuum she could feel down to her bones. In the days that followed, notes that had been clear faltered. Small changes began to appear in the company's drafts. Phrases that had not been there before. Lines that pushed obligations onto rank-and-file workers. Files were lost, then corrupted during a vital backup. A security audit showed an access log with a missing window. Lucia reported the pen's theft to Marco, and then, when nothing else altered, to corporate security. They wrote an incident report and shrugged, the kind of official gesture that creates a record but not necessarily a remedy. Willis smirked when he heard the rumor that a cleaning woman's pen had disappeared. Men of entitlement often see objects as proof of conquest. The deletion of files happened the night after she reported it. A key folder, translations labeled external final, vanished. Someone had overwritten it. The timing was sharp, 48 hours before Hangtech's live negotiation, when ambiguity would work best for someone seeking advantage. Emails burned and reappeared with new language. An assistant received a technical memo that snowballed into the CEO's inbox with a signature that was not hers. Each small erasure felt like a measure taken against those who had no voice. Lucia felt herself compact into a single task: find the evidence. The journal, Raphael's scrawl on thin paper, had taught her to look for patterns. He had taught her that handwriting persisted and that technical idioms resisted half-truths. She began quietly to retrace the chain of custody for the files, leaning on friends whose small tasks allowed them access to logs and timestamps. Priya Sharma, a junior analyst who hovered in open-plan offices and would one day be precisely the kind of person Lucia might be, noticed the inconsistencies and asked questions. Priya was young and nervous and hungry for an ally. Her curiosity could be sharp. Priya found discrepancies in the server logs. There was a window of access that matched Willis's swipe badge, a time when his account had pinged the archive for external final. But logs can be edited. Willingness to believe is a fragile ally in a company fortified by lawyers. Lucia needed something that could not be argued away: a witness, a recording, a piece of paper with handwriting that linked motive to act. She returned to Raphael's journal more and more. In the margins, he had transliterated idioms. The way certain Chinese legal phrasing had been mistranslated, often to favor one side over the other. He taught readers to ask, who benefits from ambiguity? The question turned the document from memory into a tool. When she tested the water, sending terse notes to anonymous inboxes and watching who replied, Willis replied first. He teased her with praise. He assumed power always presented itself as a compliment. He called her a ghost hand, and the word made her stomach hollow in both pride and disgust. Willis began to claim the loyalty of lesser staff, to hush talk in corridors, to plant tiny doubts. He hinted that someone leaking translations might be a security risk, and in his tone there was the delicious suggestion of a scapegoat. Threats of deportation surfaced in shadowy ways. Lucia had arrived in the country on papers that prioritized her father's job, and the wind of corporate rumor could twist documents if someone decided to play rough. A whispered interview, a mistaken check of status. The tools of vulnerability were brittle and sharp. Lucia knew the law would not protect them quickly enough if a powerful man decided to press. Willis's sabotage escalated. He deleted a backup. He planted an altered clause in a draft, then noticed it and suggested a correction that favored his contractor. He whispered insinuations about who had access to files, and suggested that the anonymous translator might be an outside saboteur. The company convened security interviews. Employees were asked to produce time cards. A casual HR manager said, with the enforced warmth of a storm shelter, "We must consider reputational risk." Lucia felt each phrase land like rain on a metal roof. On the 48th hour, Lucia made a choice she had not felt brave enough to make the first time. She stepped out of anonymity with a test. She posted a subtle correction to the translation, one that, if accepted, would reveal the clause's operative meaning in plain English instead of passive euphemisms. She did not sign it. She offered it through a chain that would lead to Priya, who forwarded it with a note, "See attached, this clarifies." Priya's forwarding was an act of courage. She risked her own visibility by touching the anonymous mail with her name. Willis co-opted the correction, as he had before. He rewrote it in his voice and sent it to the board. But this time, someone in security watched too closely. Marco, who had a camera in the corridor that faced the side entrance to the server room, replayed footage he had on a hunch. The footage was grainy and bureaucratic looking. Two men at a console at midnight, a badge swipe, a hand reaching for a keyboard. The hand that reached for the keyboard had a cufflink with an emblem Lucia knew, Willis's sigil. The grainy footage would be meaningless in a narrative designed to silence. Still, it could not be easily erased. The midpoint reversal had come. Willis's anonymous theft and deletions were no longer invisible. He had made himself visible by making the wrong decisions in the wrong place. Lucia could use this. But to use it, she needed the journal to provide the moral weight, the linguistic expertise that could make an otherwise explainable server access into proof of purposeful sabotage. Raphael's notes, properly organized, would show an expert's reading of the ambiguous clause, the precise way certain terms functioned in Chinese legalese, and how the English avoided the correct burden. It was not brilliant sleight of hand, only consistent reading. It was technical and stubborn, the kind of thing that an engineer's mind left as a breadcrumb for anyone who cared to follow. She took the journal with the careful reverence one uses for a relic. She recopied the margins into a single, tidy appendix, annotating it with dates and example uses pulled from prior contracts. She marked where translations had been softened in the past to allow employers to shift liability. She added her voice, concise, exact, clear. At the same time, she set a trap. She arranged for Marco to keep a recording, legal, simple, to capture any attempt to manipulate the day's public feed during the negotiation. She asked Priya to keep a copy of the translation thread and the server logs she had pulled. Priya, with hands that trembled but eyes steady, printed emails and hid them in her desk. They were small, domestic acts of resistance. Willis noticed the tightening. He sent a private message to Priya, thinly veiled threats about career consequences. He called Lucia reckless in a corridor where his tone could carry. He suggested that a cleaner who meddled could create liability. The rhetoric was clinical, like a surgeon dissecting an inconvenience. Lucia felt fear in the marrow, which, she noted with a sharpness that was almost humorous, has a way of focusing the mind. When Min's coughing woke her in the night, Lucia would sit on the edge of the bed and read a paragraph of the journal aloud as if the words themselves could be a charm against the world. Butien Kwansai Butiaole, Raphael had written in one margin, not as superstition, but as strategy. No one shows grief until the casket appears. The phrase is blunt. People ignore harm until there is undeniable proof. Lucia resolved to make the casket appear. The negotiation day arrived with a brittle clarity. The boardroom smelled of coffee and new leather. Victor Reeves, CEO, moved through the room with the smoothness of someone who had learned how to measure tides by the rate of his own reflection. He watched the live link to Hangtech with the careful interest of a man who believed reputations were assets he could trade. Willis walked in like a man who had paid for confidence in installments. Lucia did not belong there by invitation. She belonged there by determination. She had obtained a temporary badge by borrowing a contractor slot, a small deception that kept her within reach of the table. Her hands were steady. The jade pen rested in the pocket of her coat where it thudded against her thigh in a private Morse of memory. The room was arranged to privileged sight. Glass walls let anyone outside check for spills and whispers. Inside, mahogany reigned. Hangtech's negotiator appeared on the video screen. Jang Park, Park Jang. Compact, composed, a man whose English slid without fanfare into Mandarin when it suited the mood. He had the look of someone who had spent his life learning to weigh opportunities and liabilities in the same breath. The stakes were not merely $27,400. The clauses would determine the allocation of work and the fate of scores of employees. Willis took the floor first. He addressed Jang with a practiced warmth, the kind that frays under pressure. He cited the translated clause, quoting Lucia's words without their ownership, and used them to assert the company's superior reading. He suggested a mutual solution that favored Willis's outsourcing partner, a partner with ties to his friends. His voice filled the room. Priya's hands were in Lucia's pocket, figuratively. She sat 2 chairs away, the copy of the emails hidden like a heart under her sweater. Marco watched the door, his body attuned to the room's architecture. Lucia listened to Willis recast words as authority and felt the old invisibility press down. Then she did something she had rehearsed alone for nights, a small act of courage that felt like whispering into a hurricane. She stood. The room turned like a set of hinged doors. Her badge granted her the temporary right to stand at a podium. The jade pen slid from her pocket as if it had a will. It lay in her palm like an oracle. Her voice came out small and exact. "Excuse me," she said in English, then softly, "对不起," sorry. Her Mandarin was clean, unadorned. "There is an interpretive error in that clause." Willis's laugh, elegant, practiced, began to rise. The men in the room expected comedy. That was when Lucia said the lines she had been rehearsing in the mirror. She read the clause in Mandarin first, the original phrasing, then the English rendering she had offered privately. She then read the literal translation Raphael had taught her, the reading that revealed what the clause allowed if one side wanted to shift responsibilities mid-contract. She spoke the phrase that Raphael had circled, the one that suggested unilateral reassignment. 单方面调整权, the unilateral right to adjust. She told them what it meant, not a minor operational discretion, but a lever to reorder labor without negotiation. Her voice did not rise. It was the calm of someone reading a technical manual aloud. There was silence. Reeves watched her with a face that did not yet decide what part of his reflected image needed saving. Jang on the screen frowned, as if the words had textured the air differently. Willis's smile thinned. "It would allow them to," Lucia said, "shift duties and reassign staff without notice. That is not a mutual concession. It's a mechanism to reduce on-site work and increase outsourcing." Priya slid a copy of the server logs into the center of the table, then slid it toward Victor Reeves as if the gravity of the paper might be enough to anchor him. Marco, who had been standing by the corridor, signaled for the recording to be played. The security monitor in the corner, set to a public playback, flicked. The room's attention, hungry for theater, turned. The grainy footage showed a figure at the server console at a time that matched the missing files. It was late. The badge shown in the corner of the screen carried a name, D. Willis. The footage had the low honesty of surveillance. No artful angles, no grandstanding, only the exactitude that would make a man named on camera squirm. Willis's laugh ran out like a tide on a flat shore. He began to speak, then stopped. Reeves' fingers tapped on the mahogany as if testing the table's acoustics. Jang's face on the screen rearranged into concern. Lucia's hands folded the jade pen like a key. "I can show you the chain of edits," Lucia said, and slid Raphael's annotated pages onto the table. She pointed to the aligned examples of prior contracts, the instances where words had been translated to operational realities. Her voice traced the line from clause to consequence in a way that could be read by anyone without legal training. It was not rhetoric, it was archiving. Willis tried to argue. His voice carried the metallic sheen of a man accustomed to reshaping narratives. "We adjusted language for efficiency," he said. "We always adjust language for efficiency." "Efficiency can mask coercion," Lucia answered. "If you meant to protect staff, the clause would read differently. The language you used gives one side disproportionate power." There was a pause that felt like a held breath in a room that depended on exhales to keep the lights on. Victor Reeves, who had made a career of balancing calculation and optics, asked for the security footage to be preserved. He asked for an immediate audit. He asked for the company counsel to be involved. The words were formal instruments. They could equally be used to diffuse or to discipline. Willis's defense narrowed to a single pretense: plausible deniability. It is a favored refuge of men who must act with malice but fear consequence. The footage undercut that. The journal undercut his reading. Priya's printed emails undercut his account of who had access and when. Reeves sat back and made a decision that would change the room's temperature. He was not a man given to grand gestures. He had watched markets and reputations with the same clinical eye, and he knew both had value. "We will suspend Mr. Willis pending a full inquiry," he said. If wrongdoing is found, consequences will follow. Willis's color shifted, not a violent loss, but the acquiescent drift of someone being measured. The laughter he had once used as a shield faded from his face like paint washed away by a conscientious cleaning. He had miscalculated the consequences of taking something that did not belong to him, and assuming the taking would keep him invisible. The boardroom's applause was anemic. People were careful to show the correct amount of surprise and the correct posture of administrative concern. Lucia felt a small and inappropriate thrill. It had the taste of toothpaste and triumph. She looked at Reeves, at Zhang's face on screen, and at Priya, who blushed and smiled with a caution that spoke of futures. Reeves approached her after the room thinned, his hands folded like a man offering a handshake that reached for purchase. "Ms. Vega," he said, the title polite and new to both of them. "Your knowledge saved us from a contractual blind spot. We owe you." There was something in his voice that recognized utility more than heroism. He was a man who knew that public scandal could cost him far more than the price of one contract. He balanced that against the optics of recognizing an employee who had been invisible. He offered, hesitant, practical, an official role, a translator on retainer, a title that would put her on payroll and offer immediate funds. He mentioned a fund to cover Min's eviction if the inquiry found systemic failure, and a stipend until the situation was resolved. Victor's language couched generosity with risk management. Lucia listened and accepted the terms on both her and her mother's behalf. She did not mistake his calculus for pure justice, but she had learned that reform often required hooks of interest from those in power. Outside in the corridor, Lucia held the jade pen again. It felt like a returned memory. Marco patted her shoulder. Priya hugged her briefly, a small, brave lock of arms. The aftermath was not tidy. Willis contested the suspension. HR interviews proliferated. Lawyers arrived with the economy of people who had been trained to harvest ambiguity. Reeves weighed brand protection and the company's obligations to shareholders. He chose a path that combined accountability with self-preservation. Willis would be removed from his role pending review. The company would initiate reforms, including clearer translation protocols and a review panel that would include a new staff translator pool with real pay and training opportunities. Not a revolution, but a set of structural changes that would, if implemented, reduce the time someone like Lucia would have to spend invisible. Willis left with a dignity purchased from a severance package that would allow him to find employment elsewhere. The company decided against public shaming that could cede legal exposure. His fall was professional, not catastrophic. A correction that protected the company's image while signaling consequence. Lucia felt neither triumph nor revenge. She felt clearer, as if the air had been rearranged slightly by the removal of an obstacle in a narrow hallway. Min's eviction was paused. Reeves found an immediate fund line to keep the produce of their house paid while the audit concluded. It was not charity. It was a hedged investment in avoiding scandal. Still, to Lucia, it felt like oxygen. She sat at the kitchen table and counted the months in her mind, the way one counts breath underwater. The company announced a pilot program, a formal translator role with promotion routes and a small scholarship fund for employees' families in need of support for medical bills and housing. Lucia's role would be part-time at first, with office hours and the modest salary. She demanded, firm, not belligerent, a clause ensuring that translators would have counsel and access to legal support if their translations exposed malpractice. Victor allowed it, less from idealism than because it reduced risk. In a small, private meeting, Reeves asked Lucia what else she would change. He listened to a woman who had never sought the floor, become precise, articulate, less like a witness and more like an actor on a stage she had been expected only to dust. She asked for transparency in translation chains, for training budgets, for pathways from contractor to staff. She asked, quietly, for a scholarship in Raphael's name for engineering students from immigrant backgrounds. Reeves scribbled, the points of a pen like a blade that could be used to make lists or divide envelopes. He agreed to consider the scholarship as part of the program, a gesture that would humanize the company publicly without costing a fortune. When Lucia finally held the jade pen in a clean room that smelled of citrus and coffee, she felt the weight of history and the lightness of a future recalibrated. The pen had been an instrument and a relic. Now it was a tool she would use in a life where her name would appear on some memos. There were consequences she had not wanted. Priya had received anonymous threats for forwarding the emails. She considered leaving the company and then stayed later because the company committed to anti-retaliation guarantees. Marco recorded his footage into the company's protected server and later received a commendation for duty. Min's health stabilized somewhat. The doctor spoke in terms that were careful and hopeful, not miraculous. Raphael's journal was placed into a protective folder in the legal department's archive, its margins annotated and recognized as evidence of linguistic expertise. Lucia found this last fact bittersweet. Her father's voice, finally archived at length, would be read by lawyers and accountants who treated his life as data. Willis left, finding work where his competence was still desired without the glare of a scandal. He was not humiliated in a way that made him small. He remained a man who had built a life around the assumption that other people's labor was a resource. Consequence had been practical, juridical, merciful in the corporate sense. Lucia accepted that the corporate heart often beat to its own rhythm of public relations and shareholder comfort. Weeks became months. Lucia's title changed. The rent stopped hanging as a threat over Min's head. She enrolled in a program to formalize her translation skills and to mentor other staff. She set up the first apprentice course for bilingual custodial staff who wanted pathways into office roles. The scholarship in Raphael's name funded a single-year grant for engineering students from immigrant families. These were small, cumulative shifts that would, over time, alter the channeling of resources. At the company's next town hall, Victor Reeves spoke about lessons learned in the kind of language designed to reassure investors and employees simultaneously. Lucia listened from the front row, her badge a small rectangle of permission. When he mentioned unforeseen risk factors and the company's new commitments, the crowd clapped politely. Lucia felt a complex swell, a relief that things had been prevented, a moral ache for all the others who still worked unseen, and a cautious optimism that structures could bend if enough people leaned on the fulcrum. The jade pen stayed in her drawer most days. Sometimes she rolled it across her palm like a prayer. Sandalwood lingered in her coat. She kept Raphael's journal on the top shelf of her bookcase, a quiet object that held the kind of knowledge that does not glitter but does its work. Months later, a reporter who had tracked the story asked her how it felt to make a billionaire's laughter fade. Lucia thought for a long time. The question was rendered as spectacle, television-friendly and crisp. In private, the moment had been nothing like a coup. It had been a slow collection of small proofs, the insistence of an overlooked person, and the willingness of a few allies to risk being seen. It wasn't funny, she told the reporter, and the answer was modest and accurate. He was laughing at what he thought would remain invisible. I made the thing visible, she added, after a beat. That visibility has consequences. For some, those consequences mean justice. For others, just a job change. It's not a miracle, it's work. Lucia understood, too, that she had not only altered a single contract, but had created a precedent. New translators came forward. The company slowly updated its policies, and other firms watched. The world did not pivot in a day, but policies seeded across a few contracts could, in years, reroute a lot of lives. At home, Min's cough softened into a rhythm that allowed for afternoons of tea. They took small walks, holding hands like two people weaving a rope from comfort. Lucia sat by Min's bed at night and read aloud from Raphael's journal, not as evidence, but as memory. The sandalwood sachet smelled of the new light. On the surface, Victor Reeves' decision to protect the company had been pragmatic. He had acted to preserve the brand that made him wealthy. But in doing so, he had agreed to measure risk in a way that placed human lives on one scale rather than treating them as interchangeable. The reformations he authorized were imperfect and lit by interest, but they existed. They were, Lucia thought, the kind of change that came when visibility made indifference costly. Lucia still polished when it was needed. She still listened when people spoke in corridors. She no longer accepted anonymity as the default for someone with language in their bones. She taught others to read ambiguities as if they were signs on a road, to understand how words can build scaffolding for either protection or exploitation. The work was quiet and slow and sometimes tender. When a new young cleaner asked what she should do if she saw a clause that felt wrong, Lucia told her the same truth her father had taught. Translate carefully, collect evidence, and find allies. There is courage in small acts, she said. There is power in precision. And always, always, keep a pen that feels like home. What the maid said had, in a single meeting, made a millionaire's laugh fade. More important, it began the slow, careful work of making sure someone like Lucia would be listened to sooner. The world remained imperfect. The victory was partial, practical, and fragile. Yet for a family that had once counted days on fingers and feared the truck at dawn, the change felt like sunlight through a cracked window. Not a full daylight, but the beginning of a morning. Lucia sat at her kitchen table, Raphael's journal open to a margin filled with shorthand and small diagrams. She traced a line with the jade pen and thought of the 72 hours that had once been a cleaver and were now, in memory, the edge of a door. She closed the book and smelled sandalwood. She kept polishing, but now, with each pass, she felt less invisible. Somewhere, the sound of laughter had been shortened by honesty and proof. Somewhere else, someone was learning how to demand to be seen. She had not set out to be a leader. She had been trying to save a home. Leadership found her because she had acted precisely, because she had gathered evidence, and because she had refused to let someone else's laughter decide what her family would owe. The jade pen sat beside her coffee. The city hummed beyond the window. When the reporter asked if she would forgive Willis someday, Lucia considered it. Forgiveness, she thought, would follow understanding, which would follow consequence, which would follow time. For now, she wanted accountability to be the measure. For now, she wanted future translations to bear signatures and protections, and for the scholarship in Raphael's name to send a different kind of legacy into the world. She stood and stretched, fingers touching the pen like the final note of a melody. Outside, a delivery truck rolled by. Inside, the house felt alive with small, ordinary things that had once been at risk. A kettle, a lamp, a breath measured in ease. Lucia closed the journal and, for the first time in a long while, slept without counting down. The morning of the scholarship unveiling was quiet in the way small dignities often are. Not announced with trumpets, but folded into the day like a clean sheet. The room chosen was a narrow library meeting space above a used bookshop, sunlight slanting through blinds and catching dust motes like moving punctuation. Someone had placed the sprig of jasmine on the podium. The sandalwood sachet was in Lucia's pocket, a private orbit against her ribs. A few chairs filled. Translators came, some older with hands that had known typewriters, some young with notebooks still soft at the spine. A woman from the cleaners' union stood in the back, arms crossed, face steady. Victor Reeves had sent a representative instead of arriving in person. Willis did not attend. His absence made a different kind of statement than his presence ever would have. A banner had been made in muted colors. Raphael Scholarship for Responsible Translation. The letters were careful, as if to teach their observers how to read with respect. Lucia placed Raphael's journal on the podium the way one might set a shield against sudden winds. She did not want to speak long. Words, she knew, could become scaffolding or trapdoor. She looked at the faces before her until the tremor in her chest settled into a steady measure. This scholarship, she said, voice neither loud nor small, is not about reward. It is about habit. It is about teaching that a clause can carry a life and a signature can carry a cost.
Time moved in days that were less sharp than the 72-hour cleaver had been, but more substantial than mere waiting. The reforms, the scholarship, the testimony of workers, all accumulated like a slow architecture. It would not erase what had happened to Raphael. It would not return mourning stolen from a family. But it formed, Lucia thought as she set the pen down, a reason to keep tending the light. That evening, Men fell asleep with a book on his chest and the television murmuring in the next room. Lucia placed Raphael's journal on the kitchen table and lit the sandalwood to an ember. The scent rose and threaded itself through the apartment like a promise. She sat a long time before she closed her eyes, the jade pen still warm under her fingers. Outside, the city carried on, the soft thud of a ball against the pavement, the distant shout of a taxi, the clatter of late dishes. Inside, the house was whole enough to hold ordinary things. Lucia let out a breath that tasted like possibility, and, for the first time since the old counting, did not start anew with fear. The work remained, ongoing, precise, necessary, but so did a settled peace that was not surrender and not triumph, only the clear, unflashy conviction that she would keep polishing what she could, day by day.